More than 60% of the world's population has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. And while that's good, it leaves many, many around the world unprotected. A lot of those people are in the global south. With us on efforts to increase global vaccine equity in Whitehorse, Yukon, Dr. Katharine Smart, president of the Canadian Medical Association. In Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, Stuart Hickox, Canada Director for the Global Advocacy Campaign, ONE. And in Ontario's capital city, Rowena Pinto, Chief Program Officer for UNICEF Canada. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Hi.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Stuart, I'll start with you. Why has the ONE campaign taken up the cause of vaccine equity?
Our mission is to end extreme poverty and preventable disease, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. So COVID response is right in the crosshairs of our work and has been our focus for the past couple of years. There's a giant gap between the global north and global south on so many issues. And once again, when it comes to vaccines and ending the pandemic, we've seen that stark inequality laid bare in front of us again. So it's the focus of our work right now.
Do you think that the pandemic has exacerbated those issues?
Oh, absolutely. The pandemic, we're talking about the need to get everyone vaccinated, but our work is going to continue for years and years because there's been such, we're calling knock-on effects on other global health and security issues, nutrition, girls' education, the fight against HIV, TB, and malaria. All of these issues have been set back by the focus on the pandemic. And, our approach to this has been there needs to be an equal approach to vaccines, access, tests, and treatments. Doing that properly would actually create infrastructure that would help deal with some of those other ongoing, more structural issues. Unfortunately, the global response has not been terrific in this sense, and that's what we're here to address.
We're going to get into that, as you said. To begin our conversation, I wanted to share a map from the Our World in Data website showing the share of people who received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine as of February 23rd, 2022. You can see how the countries shaded in dark green, such as Canada, the US, Western Europe, Australia, Brazil, and China, most of their populations have received at least one dose, while most of Africa is shaded in light colors, indicating their populations have yet to receive their first dose. The site also says only 12% of people in low-income countries have received at least one dose. Rowena, when you look at that map, what jumps out at you?
Well, absolutely. We are still dealing with a vaccine inequity. And as you might know, actually, February 24th is an interesting day. It's the first, it actually is the first year anniversary of when COVAX delivered its first round of doses to Ghana in Africa. And the idea behind COVAX was to ensure that there was vaccine equity and that, it didn't matter where you were in the world, you would still have access to the COVID-19 vaccine. We know, and we can see very plainly with that map, that unfortunately that hasn't happened. There has been some gains. The COVAX facility, of which UNICEF is a key delivery partner, has delivered up to 1 billion vaccines to date. However, 80% of the world's COVID-19 vaccine supply that was available last year went to G20 countries. And hence, we are in the situation where we are now, where only about 10% of people in low-income countries have even received a first dose. And some of the contexts in which we are needing to deliver vaccines are some of the most difficult. And in addition to vaccines, we're not seeing the delivery of rapid tests and PPE and all the other things that are really needed to stop the pandemic.
Katharine, Rowena mentioned COVAX, which is the global initiative aimed at equitable vaccine distribution. The anniversary was this past Thursday. What's the connection between vaccine equity and reducing the spread of COVID-19?
I think what we know is this is a global pandemic of an infectious disease, and that no one in the world is really going to be safe until all global citizens have had the opportunity to be vaccinated. We know that variants will continue to emerge as long as COVID is circulating freely, and that's what's happening in many parts of the world. And I think it creates a real false sense of security for those of us who have had the privilege to be vaccinated. And we're seeing that in Canada, the sentiment that the pandemic is over. And I think that's really not true for many reasons. And the longer that we leave this issue of vaccine equity on the table without resolving it, the more variants we're going to see, the longer this pandemic is going to drag on. And of course, the most distressing part is the loss of life that will continue in the global south that could be prevented through vaccination.
You mentioned that, here in Ontario, it feels as if the pandemic is over. And I think for a lot of the pandemic, it seems as if each country was concerned with taking care of its own. How then do we change that now when some of us do feel like it is over?
I think that's why conversations like this are so important, is to remind people that we do live in a globe where there's different situations for different people, and that we cannot have the hubris to think that we're done with this when we haven't done our job in terms of creating equity for other global citizens. So I think keeping that awareness front and center for our population, keeping the pressure on our government to deliver on the promises they've made for vaccine delivery in the global south, keeping this conversation top of mind, I think is really critical.
What would you say is the percentage of the world's population that would need to be vaccinated in order to make a difference?
Well, I think ideally we want to see as many people vaccinated as possible. I think we know from that herd immunity perspective with the new variants that we're seeing that that number is probably as high as 85 or 90%. Now, of course, some people will have immunity from having been infected themselves. So at this point, I think it's hard to nail down an exact number. But what's very clear is the vaccines are incredibly effective in terms of preventing severe disease and hospitalization. And there's many people in the global south that are losing their lives because of lack of access to vaccination. So the more people that can be vaccinated, the better. The sooner we can achieve that, the more lives that we'll save.
And Rowena, you mentioned that UNICEF is a partner with COVAX, and you mentioned what your organization has done. Is there enough supply to meet the demand?
Well, yes, interestingly enough, there was definitely supply issues last year. So not surprisingly enough, to anybody who's listening to this, high-income countries got the bulk of the supply, and other countries, low and middle-income countries, had a harder time getting their hands on supply. But now vaccine production has ramped up, and in addition, through the generosity of many countries who have excess vaccine supply, the supply issue doesn't seem to be the problem. What is the problem is, I guess, to a certain extent, when the supply arrives. So in many cases, it comes on an ad hoc basis, especially when it comes to donations. So we very much appreciate all the dose donations, but we need them to come at a time that we can plan, that countries are able to ramp up, that they have the time to put forth a mass vaccination effort, similar to what we needed to do here in Canada. And so they have to come with a shelf life of at least 10 weeks. We were getting sometimes vaccines that only had a shelf life of 2 weeks. So obviously very hard to roll that out. But I would also echo that, for example, rapid tests, which are so important in terms of identifying outbreaks and isolating individuals so that there isn't that unfettered ongoing rapid spread. Again, those are big issues. We don't have enough access in low-income countries to those tools either. And high-income countries actually use rapid tests 80 times more than low-income countries. So it's just have to look at the issue in a much more holistic way as well.
Stuart, I can only imagine if you are living in a low-income country and you're relying on donations from high-income countries. Is that the way that we should do it?
No, it's not ideal. The whole notion that we donate, these people in the developing world want to be vaccinated as much as we do. They deserve to have access the way that we do. We started out in such a promising approach to this with COVAX, and our own government, an early investor and supporter of the COVAX and the ACT Accelerator, which is dedicated, as Katharine mentioned, to equity. The way the pandemic should have been responded to is that the most vulnerable people in all countries gain first access to vaccines. That was what the intention was. That first responders and the most vulnerable, immune compromised people people in the developing world can't socially isolate the way that we do here. They don't have economies that can support them living and working at home. And yet, even though we invested early in COVAX and ACT Accelerator, what we did was we procured most of the supply. As Rowena said, it's really just another example of structural inequality and even racism. And that makes people really uncomfortable to talk about that. But this is a pattern of behavior of how the global North and the South integrate. They're not waiting for us to give them things. They have the expertise to develop vaccines and manufacture them in their own countries. If we could just twist the arms of the pharmaceutical companies to recognize the value of people over profit. I mean, ultimately, it seems a little unfair that children in Canada, and I know we all care about our children, but why is a 5-year-old in a wealthy middle-class family in Canada getting vaccinated before an HIV survivor or an AIDS grandmother or a frontline worker in Africa? We had enough surplus vaccines in this country last year beyond what we needed to vaccinate every frontline health worker in Africa, and we didn't convert or share back or redirect those doses. So, and I just want to add one other thing to what you said, to what Katharine said, that this is, the problem right now is not technology, it's not knowledge, it's focus. And we had a tantalizing taste of freedom last summer, but then ironically, a variant emerged, as many people predicted in November, Omicron. And we had the experience of going back into lockdown and learning that, okay, maybe it's true that even though we're highly vaccinated here, we're not going to escape this until everyone does. But now, once again, the urgency seems to be receding. We're opening up. We're letting go of our measures to protect us. Social pressure is on the government to release, to let us get back to normal. But the fact is, it's not going to work until we deal with this problem and enable developing countries to manufacture their own vaccines and invest in COVAX. We are at high risk of another variant coming. And it's particularly precarious now because it will be more difficult for our governments to put in place measures to protect us once they've taken them all down, not to mention the huge economic cost of going back into lockdown or other measures to support our economies in a new variant. So we're in a particularly perilous time.
You brought up some comments some issues that I want to come back to, but you mentioned pharmaceutical companies. 6 African countries, that's Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tunisia, are set to receive the technology to produce mRNA vaccines. How willing have pharmaceutical companies been to share the technology necessary to produce COVID-19 vaccines, Stuart?
Well, I know Katharine probably has a strong opinion on this too, but from our perspective, it's extremely frustrating to see, once again, the profit versus people model. And our own countries and our own governments have been reluctant to push pharmaceutical manufacturers in this direction about releasing or temporarily waiving intellectual property rights to meet this urgent global unprecedented need when we are negotiating with these companies to provide supplies for our own domestic populations. So, I mean, the 6-hub experiment or, investment that the World Health Organization is working on is really critical. And it doesn't seem that the main mRNA vaccine manufacturers are particularly keen on engaging with that. That's something where we need to continue to keep pressure on our governments to press the pharmaceutical companies and work within those mechanisms to make sure that the restrictions are loosened, frankly.
Katharine, is it a positive step that 6 countries have received this technology to produce their own vaccines?
I think it's a critical step. As we're hearing, we need countries to be able to have that domestic production or regional production so that they can prioritize their citizens. As I think what's clear is the rest of the world to this point has failed in that delivery. So I think the sharing of that technology, the ability for regional production of vaccines to create the predictability that's so critical for delivery is a very important next step. And I think, it's unfortunate it hasn't happened till now. But at least on a go-forward basis, we're going to see that ability. And I think that will be very important in terms of the next few months.
Katharine, how would you rate the Canadian government's contributions to global vaccine equity?
Well, I think what we've seen right now is, Canada has made good on part of its promise, but certainly not all of it. They, mid-February, they delivered, I think it was 13.5 million doses to COVAX. They've promised over 200 million doses by the end of this year. So we have a long ways to go to make good on that promise. And I think, again, as we've heard from the other guests, it's not just about numbers of vaccines, it's also about timing. There needs to be predictability. Other countries need to be able to plan for their delivery. So we need to do not only just getting the vaccines there, but getting them there in a reliable way. So I think Canada still has a lot of work to do to make good on their promise.
Rowena, it's one thing to have access to these vaccines, but we've seen anti-vaccination sentiment and vaccine hesitancy in North America. Is that also happening in developing countries?
Well, absolutely. I mean, anytime you want to be able to vaccinate a lot of people on a very quick basis, there is going to be vaccine hesitancy as the information rolls out. And we know with the COVID-19 vaccines, they're incredibly new, and there has been a lot of misinformation that has been shared. So people in low-income countries, they're no different than people here in Canada, and they need the proper information and the proper time to process and make the right decision for them and their families. UNICEF is working with partners on the ground in all of the contexts that we talked about in low and middle income countries, to really work to understand where there might be vaccine hesitancy and to work to deal in those specific areas. It's not a one size fits all. We're working with partners like one in some of the countries that we serve. And it really is about ensuring that healthcare workers have the capacity and the training, community leaders are engaged so that populations and communities are hearing the information from people they already trust. And then there is that whole idea of ensuring that we're getting to people in the most remote settings. So not everyone has the ability to share information as we do here in Canada. And we have to remember that in some contexts, they have other issues that are very pressing. There's not a huge digital infrastructure to share information. Many countries are in the middle of conflict, crisis. There's malnutrition crises going on. Other epidemics are happening when it comes to measles, et cetera. So there's healthcare infrastructure that doesn't exist that we enjoy here in Canada. So it really is, again, going to these countries with the ability to have adequate resources to support them in the way they need to be supported, and ensuring that vaccines become vaccinations.
Before we started taping, I shared that in Uganda, where I'm from, people have been kind of duped. People have been selling fake vaccines. When the lockdowns happened, and a lot of people, it's like if you don't work that day, you don't eat. And as we know, the data shows that there are many people around the world who haven't even received one dose. It's one thing to procure the vaccines, but how do you convince people to get vaccinated if they know that they've been kind of last on the list and so far they haven't gotten COVID? Stuart?
That's a really good point. I'm glad you raised that because, people often use the perception of additional hesitancy in the developing world as an excuse to not take action. It's a problem that we in the global north have largely created through other programs, through generations. These countries have been given the last access to vaccines and treatments of all kinds. They've been told what to do by governments rather than being engaged as partners. This stuff has come from outside the continent rather than drawing on the enormous technical and social expertise of these countries. So it's an excuse that's not particularly valid, and it can be addressed by more direct action and building infrastructure and supporting local organizations and governments to be more engaged in supplying their own needs, as is the case with most poverty reduction strategies. The side-on effect of all of this, of doing this properly, once again, is that if we get this right and we partner with the developing world and we help them build infrastructure and we create resilience through their vaccination programs, this will prepare us all for the next pandemic and for other global health crises. The organizations that are involved in COVAX and the ACT Accelerator are all leading organizations that have been involved in mass vaccination campaigns in the developing world already. There's a lot of expertise already there. It just needs to be harnessed and enabled and supported, and that's largely through funding, but also through the other things that the other guests have mentioned, such as PPE and refrigeration, and some of that support, political support. But it means our leaders here have to start thinking beyond our own borders and put the lives of other people as highly on the pedestal as our own.
Well, speaking of our borders, Katharine, when Omicron hit, there was a push for people to get their booster shots. Right now in Ontario, if you're older than 12, you can get a booster shot. Was that a mistake given how unvaccinated so much of the world continues to be?
I think that's a really important question. And I think it weighs on the minds of some people who have in Canada chosen to receive their third booster. Am I making this decision for myself at the expense of someone else? And I think that would have been true several months ago when vaccine production wasn't necessarily where it needed to be globally. So we were taking our share of vaccines at the expense of other countries. We're now at a place where the amount of vaccines that are being produced monthly are adequate to meet the needs of boosting our population while simultaneously providing vaccines to the global south. The issue is how they're being distributed, how they're being procured, and how we're actually sharing the vaccines that are available around the world. So I think we're in a fortunate position now that we don't necessarily need to be making the choice between those things. But what we do need to be doing is prioritizing getting the vaccines that are available to the countries that need them.
And Rowena, when we talk about booster shots, how low-income countries even had that option?
Well, as I mentioned, only about 10% of people in low-income countries have even had their first shot. But I just wanted to I guess, echo what the other guests have said, is that we can't end this pandemic one country at a time. That is absolutely impossible. We saw with the rise of Omicron that where there is no protection or a lack of protection in other parts of the country, there is mutation of the virus, and it will come back to us, and all of the little short-lived freedoms we might enjoy right now, we'll lose them. And so we really need to look at this much more holistically. We need to prioritize helping the rest of the world get vaccinated and have the other tools in the toolbox available to them. And it isn't charitable. I guess we're using the word donation of doses. But it is not a charitable act. It really is an investment in all of our futures. So, where there is actually, you can go beyond the ethical and the moral imperative to do this, which there absolutely is one. But there's actually a self-interest as well, and that countries need to look at the fact that this will not end for any of us unless it ends for all of us. And so let's prioritize this. We all want to get out of the pandemic. We all want everything to go back. We as the leading organization when it comes to children around the world, we are seeing what is happening to children around the world. Many schools remain closed. The motivations to get our population booster shots and keep schools open and open businesses, that is no different for people in low-income countries. And what is happening is that there are millions of children that might never go to school, that are being forced into child labor, child marriage. So the impact and the implications of inaction on when it comes to vaccinating the world and fighting the pandemic together will have forward impact on all of us. So like I said, it's really important that we start to prioritize the world and the global efforts and not just try and end this pandemic country by country.
Katharine, I have a big question to ask. Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead, Stuart.
I really want to switch gears a little bit to try and reach the audience, because I think implied in all of this discussion is a sense of being passive. We waited for our government to procure doses. We wondered whether we should get a third dose and whether that was responsible. And I think, as Katharine mentioned, we were each thinking like, well, it's here, it's available, and it will protect me. I should do this. Some kind of resignation there. But I think now is a time when we need to call for people to be more actively engaged. Maybe, instead of talking about blaming and shaming and looking at the past and how things were done, but recognizing that it wasn't the best rollout that ever. There's a role for the individual now, Canadian, in this. And the passive role is like recognize where we are in our relatively good position and how fortunate we are to have had access to first, second, and third,
3rd.
doses. But we want people to contact their members of parliament to urge them to take the steps necessary to ensure that to get behind this idea of vaccine equity, to make sure that people who don't have a voice have equal access to tests, treatments, and vaccines. The only way our politicians are going to make this a priority, particularly when Omicron is receding and governments are opening up, and we see other things happening in the world that are going to obscure the debate, such as the recent action in Ukraine, we need to keep the political pressure and support on our government to move decisively in this direction. Otherwise, we risk it fading away, and then we're all at greater risk of a new variant and further pandemic. It just will keep going.
And Katharine, I have about a minute left, and I have a big question. I'm trying to surmise everything that you all three said, because with the booster shots, we know that, well, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the efficacy wanes after a certain period of time. If we're debating whether or not we should be getting a fourth booster, while keeping in mind, Rowena mentioned the self-interest that we need to think globally. Each country, I don't know, how do you pivot from worrying about your own population, but if you don't expand your self-interest outside to the global community, there is that real concern that another variant will come and destroy the efforts of those countries. So how does anyone balance all those things in a way while we try to promote this idea of vaccine equity?
I think that's a really important question, and I think there's several aspects to the answer. One is what our expectation of vaccines are. So when we're talking about waning effectiveness, what we're really meaning is the ability of the vaccine to prevent you from being infected from COVID. And that has changed with new variants. But what hasn't changed is the effectiveness of the vaccine in terms of preventing hospitalization and severe disease, which is the most important outcome. And it's not clear that additional vaccines are necessary to maintain that protection. So I think we need to perhaps adjust what our expectation of the vaccines are, and that will be critical. And I absolutely agree. I think the next priority, and what should have been the priority all along, is the importance of getting as many people around the world vaccinated with that primary series. That is critical. That has to happen. We've waited long enough. We need to make that our next priority. So I think we need to step back from worrying about these small details that we worry about here because of the privilege we have, and really getting that global picture of until we have everybody safe, no one is safe. And as Canadians, we have to keep our voices strong to government in terms of making this a priority.
We'll leave it there. Thank you to the three of you. I know your schedules are so busy. We really do appreciate all the work that you've been doing throughout this. Thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nam.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.